I'm a comparative physiologist, so I'm sort of interested in particularly diving physiology. So understanding the physiological changes and sort of processes involved in animals that have to hold their breath and then obviously leave access to air to dive to move around and forage. And I guess the sort of two main focuses of my research are diving humans, so for like free diving humans, but also indigenous divers that spend a significant proportion of their time underwater. And then the sort of, we call the sort of professional divers, so the sort of the seals and sea lions and dolphins. And our sort of main goals at the moment are to try to sort of take technology from biomedicine, non-invasive technology, and try and implement those in the marine environment, which is quite a significant challenge because you can sort of imagine what it's like dropping your phone into seawater. You're sort of taking something much more expensive than a phone that's supposed to be in a nice sort of controlled lab and put it on an animal or a human that's off at sea diving and have it work and collect a whole range of data. So the technology is called near infrared spectroscopy. And basically, it's quite like what's in a lot of sort of smartwatches, the sort of flashing LEDs on the underside. And basically what they do is there's two wavelengths and they emit light. And then with a bit of mathematics, basically what we can tell is how much of the blood in that tissue. And we're primarily interested in the brain because of the sort of inability to breathe or, lack of access to air. And those flashing LEDs tell us, how much oxygenated and deoxygenated blood there is in the tissue. And then from that, we can do a range of things. We can sort of understand tissue oxygenation, blood oxygenation, even blood flow, intracranial pressure, just a whole, even respiration rate, how deep a breath is, a whole range of stuff that's really, really difficult to understand whenever you can't see what your subject is. And of course, if you're working on something like a seal that can spend, anything like up to about 8 months at sea, there's no other way of sort of understanding it. So being able to do that just using a couple of flashing LEDs for us is potentially quite transformative. So at the minute, we're sort of in the progress of sort of taking steps of, let's solve this problem with the technology, let's get it to work underwater, let's see how it does. Well, we get some interesting data. How do we improve that data? How do we start to understand that data? And that's where the sort of humans come into it. They're a nice kind of bridge between, the clinic to the sea, and to a totally different animal, like something that's evolved to hold its breath and dive underwater. And it's very complicated physiology. They're the sort of nice intermediate. So that's sort of what my my background is and my sort of overall sort of current research is at the moment. Our work, as I said, we're interested in humans as a sort of intermediate between taking what is a tool developed for humans, but trying to use it in the marine environment to understand the same sort of physiological parameters, but in marine mammals. So we our sort of first application of the NIRS technology in humans was on elite freediving humans. So we went to the World Championships, the freediving World Championships in 2019 to work on some of the very, very best divers in the world. So that was quite a sort of an eye-opening experience sort of for me, because they were a good intermediate sort of model, as we call it. But once I sort of got there and started to see their performance in its own right, they're effectively outstanding marine mammals. Their diving ability is phenomenal. And sort of it was great sort of support for the idea of the technology, because the sort of insight that we got was incredibly unique, because it's now a tool that you can put on a human or an animal and they can just go and dive. They're not restrained, they're not in a lab, they're getting the full diving experience, the drop in oxygen, the increase in pressure, free falling through the water instead of swimming and then actively having to swim back up. So when we put the instrument on, we've seen some really phenomenal changes. One of the sort of standout ones was just how low their blood oxygen gets. So normally your blood oxygen saturation, which usually when you go into the doctor, or if you're in the hospital, they put the little instrument on the end of your finger, sort of what we're using is kind of like the Rolls Royce version of it. So usually when you put that on your finger, if everything's well and you're healthy, your saturation is about 98%. And so once you start to get below about 85%, that's usually when there's, clinically some concern for you. Once you start to get below sort of 60%, 50%, that's the point that you should, be expected to start losing consciousness. Some of the lowest values that we got from the divers, from the really elite sort of top 3 divers, were as low as 25%. So catastrophically low, but they're fine, right? Sort of right at the end of a dive, just as they're about to hit the surface, the lowest we got was 25%. And that's sort of in the blood that's effectively being delivered to the brain. And the brain as well, as you would expect, is incredibly low saturation. So normally with the instrument, saturation in the brain is about 70%, because it's a mix of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, or arterial and venous blood. So normally it's about 65, 70%. But the lowest we got in those divers was 14%. So just absolutely catastrophically low numbers, vastly exceeding what we expected to see. And then from the instrument, we also get things like heart rate, so really useful basic values. And so, usually your heart rate for most people is in around sort of 60 to 80 beats per minute. The lowest that we got on the divers when they were right at the bottom of a dive, sort of plus 100 meters on a breath, we got down to 11 beats per minute. So, it's like with 5 seconds between beats. And then, sort of sustained low heart rates. So much so that the heart rates get so low that it seems to, the whole cardiovascular system seems to be pushed past its sort of, I guess, normal operating limits. So we've seen that at those points that we would get an increase in blood pressure, so measured at the level of the brain, and as a result of that, an increase in intracranial pressure. So it's a complete physiological assault in the divers, and this is why they're holding their breaths at 100 meters, where the lungs are completely collapsed, down to a fraction of your normal volume. So basically down to the size of about a Coke can, from what is each of their lungs are about 4 liters, very, very large lung capacity. So it was just fascinating to be able to get that insight in the diver, without asking them to do anything. They're just doing their normal sort of practice diving for the competition, but seeing just how extreme their physiology is. And that in itself, as I say, was really good for the tool to show that it works, but in its own right, just showing how incredible these humans are as a sort of model, even just to understand things like what is the working limits, the cardiovascular system, and to sort of do it, safely. But also it started to raise questions about things like mild traumatic brain injury, because such an elevation in blood pressure, such low brain oxygen, increases in intracranial pressure are all things that the body sort of tries to regulate against. So seeing all sort of opened up a whole other avenue of these people may be informative in terms of understanding mild traumatic brain injury, but it gave us great hope for the tool and sort of moving forward to do something sort of similar, but in a free ranging sort of seal or sea lion or dolphin. There's sort of research now that's sort of starting to focus on that. Of course, in sort of many branches of science, longitudinal studies are quite difficult, to one, to get money for, but two, the freediving community is quite broad in terms of it happens all over the world, to sort of follow individuals reliably over time. But there are efforts sort of towards that at the moment. So we're focusing on mild traumatic brain injury markers within the divers, sort of before diving, after diving, in the sort of day, 24 hours after diving. And we're now sort of doing some collaborations with the University of Split and the University of British Columbia to start looking longitudinally over sort of a 4 to 6 year period to see if there is any evidence of increases in those sort of markers over time, and evidence that there may be longitudinal consequences of the sport, or sort of the very extreme level of the sport, or if it is sort of just isolated. They do incur some evidence of mild traumatic brain injury, but it's sort of isolated to a brief recovery period after that. So they, again, exactly, they're just a great model to understand extreme physiology because of the nature of what the individuals like to do, which is a very, very extreme sport. Going into it, I was sort of just interested in them as the translation. We know a lot about human physiology, so we can put the tool on humans that was developed for, and that will provide us with that sort of first scope into there's a lot goes on, as I say, changes in oxygenation, changes with pressure, and sometimes they're swimming, sometimes they're not swimming, and it's just a complicated dynamic system. So sort of making the jump to humans in that scenario, in that situation, was an easier step than going all the way to a marine mammal. But then, yeah, they're so interesting in their own right. We've kind of branched off into the sort of animal-focused diving research, but also the sort of human research is with their own focus rather than just being sort of translational steps.
Brilliant. And you mentioned that you're.
So this project, I've sort of been, I guess at the sort of middle of it because I'm interested in the physiology, but this work has been incredibly collaborative. So I'm sort of speaking on behalf of a huge team here. So because we're kind of working at the interface of ecology, sort of ecophysiology, meaning, the sort of physiology of animals, sort of neuroscience as well, because we're very brain focused, clinical science, in terms of, we work a lot with sort of doctors and anesthesiologists for our work, and then right at the sort of focus of point of engineering and biomedical optics. So it's really a sort of, and indeed some of the work we do involves chemistry and direct physics as well. So it's a really broad collaboration between, a lot of institutes in the UK, like St Andrews, Aberdeen, Plymouth, Cambridge, but then sort of branching out across Europe, at the University of Bordeaux in France and the University of Padova in Italy, right across to Carnegie Mellon in the US, and Santa Cruz and San Diego, University of British Columbia. So it's a really broad collaboration, sort of bringing all of those aspects of the technology development, the understanding of physiology, the understanding of brain function, and then indeed, what, getting to the bottom of the question, is it what is it that drives or limits the behavior of a seal that's diving somewhere in the North Sea. So it's absolutely, we're completely reliant upon collaboration for this project, and it's really wonderful because you have one collaboration say, okay, we want to get that tool to work underwater, and then that springs out sort of new questions from the research that you do and the results that you get, and they say, well, okay, now we need someone from a clinician to help us interpret those data, and they say, well, that's those physiological responses, that's very interesting for us to understand something like maltraumatic brain injury, and then indeed, okay, well, now we're looking at a seal. Oh, it's interesting that the responses are different in a seal. Is that because they're conditioned to the the physiological assault, or they're evolved to adapt to it or to resist it? And then you end up getting into, well, we need some neuroscientists to help us interpret that, or just ecophysiologists, because what's the animal doing at that time? So it's been, I'm effectively riding on the coattails of all of these other disciplines, but yeah, it's really heartening that they're helping us get to where we want to get to. But the sort of nature of both the human divers and the seals and dolphins are also interesting to them. So it's become a very sort of synergistic and really sort of really nice and sort of collegiate environment. But it is absolutely fundamental to all the research that I'm doing. It is collaboration, and without that, any of this work wouldn't have got off the ground. Key step, I think, for what we're doing at the moment, if we just take the seal side of things, is that as I said, we've sort of done the at sea deployments in humans where they're diving at sea. But it's obviously quite simple. As you get on the boat, you instrument them, they get in the water, do the thing, get back in the boat. Whereas in the sort of free ranging animals, you're taking a really expensive tool, putting it on an animal that isn't very careful with the tool, that then disappears off to sea, that you may never see again. And then the tool has to work for many days to many weeks to many months. So we've just recently, earlier in the year, made our first sort of at sea deployment on elephant seals in the US. So successfully, so we've got a lot of really, really nice data that's going to inform the next step, which is for a lot of the instruments that we develop here at the Sea Mammal Research Unit is, as I say, we never see the animal again. So we're completely reliant on those instruments to be very, very intelligent in what they do with the data. So they collect the data, but they have to be able to break that data down into sort of small packages that you can transmit via mobile phone network, because we probably never see the animal again. So what we need to do with the near-infrared spectroscopy is to sort of find, with the data that we've got, what are the most important features of those data, or how can we break that data down to sort of, yeah, get it into that small package to transmit it. So that's sort of our next step. So, and at the moment, most, if not all, of the physiological monitoring we do tends to be logged, and then you need to get the animal back again. So this would be a really big step for physiological monitoring in animals, in that we could just instrument the animal. All of that physiological information is being collected, non-invasively with a couple of lights, could then be sent to us, sitting in our office, looking at our computer through the mobile phone network. So there's quite a lot of, I guess, thinking and sort of ideas, and then implementing that in the sort of software, and maybe some changes to the hardware. And then on the human side of things, we're now really focused on sort of combining the technology we're using with markers for traumatic brain injury, but then trying to sort of refine how we measure traumatic brain injury using, it says in our collaborations with chemistry, with Mike Weil at the University of Plymouth. We're trying to implement breathomics so that we can sort of have potentially aim to have a much sort of more rapid and easy to measure barometer of traumatic brain injury, just looking at the sort of chemical makeup of exhaled breath. So we're trying to relate what's happening actually in the diver in terms of blood pressure and heart rate and oxygenation and intracranial pressure, and trying to sort of see, can we define or look for any evidence of thresholds or above which sort of suggests that this diver's probably been exposed to like physiological conditions that would sort of precede traumatic brain injury, but then trying to find a way using exhaled breath that we can just sort of not have to rely upon blood measurements or waiting until after a diver's been diving for 3 or 4 days to get a result. And that's something we're quite excited about, because just the nature of free diving and what they're already sort of they do as their recreation or their sort of profession, and so providing us with a nice sort of data set with exposures to mild traumatic brain injury, that we're able to start implementing those different tools to sort of refine what we're doing, and hopefully be able to get evidence for mild traumatic brain injury just from an exhaled breath at the end of the dive, and hopefully be able to tell the diver soon after, yes, you have evidence of mild traumatic brain injury, you shouldn't be diving for the next number of days, or however long it takes for that to decay.